Can America boost its relations with the world? Michael Carroll, who heads the Holling Center for International Dialogue, thinks the answer is yes. He'll explain why next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. One of the biggest challenges for the United States today is improving its communication with other countries and cultures. Michael Carroll, who is the executive director of the Holling Center for International Dialogue, takes on that job every day. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Talk to us about international dialogue today versus a few decades ago. It used to be that the United States was welcomed in many places, and its culture still is to some extent, but now we seem to have pushback at so many levels. Why is it harder today, and why do we have to work at it more?
I think a big reason why it's a lot harder today has a lot to do with the age we're living in. It's the information age. We're living in an age now where data, information is being collected and disseminated at a faster rate than we ever could at possible. Social media being an excellent example. Some of the combatant things that we have to do now are through the social media sphere. But the reality is that in this age of knowledge, we're not doing as well in the age of understanding. To paraphrase an analogy I had heard recently, the difference between knowledge and understanding. Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but understanding is knowing it has no business in a fruit salad. So as a result of that, we need to be doing better on that second hand, that understanding, and that's something that where dialogue is actually critically important. And in an age where the information is coming at such a fast flow, and in an age where it's easier to check the box to do a development project or to scale things down to a very specific time frame, there isn't necessarily an aptitude or an appetite anymore for the kind of long engagement that we used to have just a few decades ago.
Tell us about the Holling Center. I think most members of our audience would be familiar with the Holling's name, and I guess international dialogue speaks for itself to some extent, but what was the origin of this program, and where is it based?
Well, we're based in Washington, D.C. and in Istanbul, Turkey, and in Istanbul is where the majority of our programs are held. We were founded in 2004, just a little over a decade ago, in the midst of obvious turmoil and concern, to bridge between Muslim majority populations and the populations here in the West, including the United States. And we were primarily founded only to specifically talk about these dialogue issues. As you mentioned, the name is pretty obvious. We were founded by Senator Hollings, formerly of South Carolina, and also Senator Gregg, formerly of New Hampshire. And when they were doing some tours back in 2003 and 2004, immediately after the Iraq invasion, they came to the conclusion that we were winning the war, but we're losing the peace. And so it was from some of those trips that they decided that it was critical that the U.S. have a center that was specifically focusing on dialogue, particularly in the Mideast, but also throughout all the Muslim majority nations. So in that spirit, they actually identified a former consulate building in Istanbul, Turkey, the Palazzo Corpi, which is a building with a very colorful history in American diplomacy. And so that's where our headquarters will be moving in sometime later this year.
And people who are interested in seeing that location can probably go to your website if you want to share that with us.
That's correct. They can go to www.hollingcenter.org, and we'll have photos of the Palazzo there. And as I noted, it's been a long tenure process, but we're really bringing it back to its original standing, which was a bridge connection between the West and the East on a whole host of diplomatic issues.
So this seems like a very wide scope. You're talking about countries in Europe, countries in North Africa, Middle East, and over into Asia. How can you possibly tend to all of the dialogue issues affecting those various countries and populations?
Well, we obviously can't tend to everything. It would be impossible to tend to everything. But one of the things that we can do is that there are scores of underserved topics that affect not just one specific region, but can affect us globally. We've bridged topics that have talked about water. Water is an issue that is going to be a global issue, whether you're in California or you're in Indonesia or the Middle East. It's going to be a big problem. We've also looked at topics such as higher education. There are wonderful best sharing practices that can be exchanged between Western institutions and institutions in the Middle East or Central Asia. By focusing on some of those underserved topics, topics that really can link various societies together, it becomes a lot easier to actually be able to focus in on really bridging some of these gaps and bringing forward dialogue that can actually be productive.
Let's talk about the water issue. As you said, it should be of interest to everyone. I've participated recently in water conferences here in the United States where they're looking at newer techniques such as fracking and saltwater intrusion. But all of this seems to point in one direction, which is we're talking about a limited resource and more demand for it with each passing day, whether it's from people or from industry or both. How do we resolve this problem? Because there isn't more water being made, and we seem to waste a lot of it. And we've reached the crisis point in many communities, and even in parts of the United States, and you referenced California.
Well, you look at California alone, it's the 7th world's largest economy. It has 38 million people, and as the LA Times recently reported, it's running out of water in its reservoirs. In the Middle East, it's the same problem. Data that I recently read suggested that the consumption rate in the Middle East for water, energy, food, everything that requires water in order to live, is 507 cubic meters per capita. And to equate that into something everybody can understand, that's over 133,000 gallons per person per year. It's a lot of water. And you're living in an area, particularly in the Middle East, that has barely 600 cubic meters of resource per capita per year, an area that's basically being maxed out. So it's a challenge that it's political, it's technological, it's economical, and it's also on a large scope, global, regional, local, but also importantly, individual. So to try to address what is obviously a large myriad of challenges, I think it's important to recognize first that there are being some technological breakthroughs that are going to really help at least take some of the stress off the situation. Membrane technologies for desalinization, solar power and other renewables being used as part of the water harvesting process. But there are also going to have to be some real changes in policies as well. You look at some of the GCC states, and they're using about 90% of their available water for the production of agriculture that doesn't really add much to their gross domestic product. Very energy-intensive kinds of things like wheat, dairy farms, cucumbers, other types of fruit. Things that really are going to be dragging down not just the river basins in the region, but also aquifers, some of which can never be recharged, some of which are completely unsustainable. There are some countries, I think, where things are just too far gone. If you look at Yemen, for example, a classic example of a failing state, almost all of their water is being used for the production of the narcotic plant khat, which is like a chewing tobacco almost. Their cheap subsidies of diesel for water pumps, as well as cheap pumps, have made a completely unsustainable picture in that country that may have exacerbated what is happening there right now, which is the state falling apart. So how do you actually start to walk that back? That's a kind of question that dialogue is really necessary for, because there's got to be local expertise, local knowledge, and also an understanding of how to link these various disciplines together in order to make that possible.
I've talked to a lot of people in developing countries and in developed countries, and some of them seem to believe that having some food production capability is essential for food security. So, you talked about expensive production in the Middle East, where generally speaking, people seem to be more conscious of water than in other places because they have so much less of it. But, a very expensive food production capability being maintained in Japan and other places. How important is that production to the food security question?
Well, it's definitely important, but not as important, I think, as many of these states are making it right now. If you look at post-Arab nationalism of the 1950s and 60s, food production was really a matter of national sovereignty, dare I even say pride, where it became a critical component to that state social contract in a lot of these states that don't have a lot of water and don't have a lot of arable land for food production. Some states are now starting to walk that back, realizing how unsustainable it really has become. Saudi Arabia, for example, has begun the phase out of the production of wheat. But that doesn't mean that they're stopping agriculture altogether, because just like in this country, they become entrenched interests once they are started. So some are beginning to shift towards less energy, less water-intensive crops, leafy crops that don't require as much water, but also have a much larger yield than, say, corn or even wheat germ. But there needs to be more. Doing what's happening so far is not necessarily enough. If you look at all of the states in the region, almost all of the water usage is still on agriculture. Not in the cities. The cities have their own wasteful problems, but it's not nearly as bad as that. So until some of these states are willing to walk back their nationalist needs for food production, shifting it, at least the agriculture that they can do, to a less water-intensive and less energy-intensive process, then you're going to continue to see these problems in a lot of those countries.
What are some of the other issues that you deal with? I'm sure the water issue is contentious enough, but when you get into cultural questions, for example, religious questions and so forth, how does that shape the dialogue, and how does it make it harder?
It can make it harder because often when you're talking about religion, it's like a classic third rail type of topic. You touch it, you die. And obviously there is a, dare I say, oversimplification often, that these types of problems really boil down to religious disagreement. And I've often found in my experience that's not actually what the problem is. In fact, there are plenty of examples that have come up in our various dialogues over time where there are actually religious principles that could be very useful in actually addressing some of these problems. Going back to water, not to overharp it too much, but there are religious tenets as well as verses of the Quran that are very, very clear about waste, and which could be applied to water. There are agricultural and resource management protection type of elements like HEMA in the Arabian Peninsula, which are very much like the conservation efforts you would see in a Western nation, just slightly styled a little bit differently. But we've also seen in other topics that the actual element of religion can play a real role in making some progress. A very popular subject we recently discussed was the whole role of Islamic banking throughout the Muslim world, where you have more local community interest in these things based in Islamic principles, where you don't charge as much interest you don't make profit off of your loans and those types of things. But they're willing to assume a little bit more risk than a traditional bank might when it comes to building up small entrepreneurial businesses, for example. So often, what we've found is that religion is not necessarily what causes a lot of the conflict. It could actually be part of the solution.
Talk to us, if you have any experience with it, about the microfinance issue in the Middle East, given the nature of Islamic banking, as you were just referencing. How does microfinance work into that? It seems like it would work into it in a pretty constructive way.
I think it definitely does. I think the problem is not necessarily the availability of microfinance at this point, because you have both Islamic banking. The microfinance story really took off in Pakistan, a couple decades ago. It's not the availability of that; it's the scalability. I think in many respects. What you really are lacking in many cases is the entrepreneurial culture that can really take these microfinance situations and convert them into real economic output. We recently concluded a conference that was actually on higher education reform, and it morphed into a conference on entrepreneurialism and how do you create a better environment for that in the Middle East, Central Asia, even South Asia. And that's part of the problem, is that these small and medium enterprises that we talk so much about in this country as critical to our economic infrastructure have not been taking hold that kind of way. Microfinance is one possibility that might help goose that. Corporate social responsibility by larger companies might be another way to help improve that. But the microfinance, it's not the availability. I think that's the problem. I think it's more, even when have successful stories, can they be scaled up beyond the local level to really start having meaningful impact? It definitely affects the lives of the individuals who take that opportunity. There's no doubt about that. And I think it's part of what needs to be the economic prescription throughout the region. But it's not all the way there yet, in my mind.
As you're looking at issues that could be the centerpiece of future dialogues. Are there any that are so contentious that people can't even agree to have a discussion about them? And what would some of those be, if that's the case?
I'm not sure it's contention, but I would say it's more oversaturation. There are interfaith dialogues all the time. There are lots of them. That talk about, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, even some that have, in South Asia that talk about, Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism. There are these kinds of interfaith dialogues that happen all the time, and I think it's a crucial component of the discussion that needs to be had as members of a global society. But I think it's oversaturated to the point where everybody's hearing this exact same thing over and over and over again, and it doesn't get to any kind of real fruition. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that's necessarily contentious. Sometimes it can be, but that's something I think that happens often, that oversaturation. There are obvious issues that can usually be non-starters. The Israel-Palestine issue can often be one that's very contentious, where if it gets injected into a discussion, it sometimes can be the end of the discussion, which is just a real difficult challenge. The difficulties of talking about past actions. You look at negotiations with Iran, things that played out in 1979 are still, very much weighing in on those discussions today, even though it happened 35 years ago. So there are these little hot buttons that can, if accidentally pushed in the middle of any discussion, can make things a little bit more difficult. But that doesn't mean that the discussion should stop.
When you're talking to someone who's interested in your organization, potentially as a career option, what do you say to that person to persuade him or her that this is a really interesting place to work? I would imagine no 2 days are the same.
No 2 days are the same, as I've found out since taking this position. I mean, there are the obvious perks of, we operate out of Istanbul, Turkey, which is one of the greatest cities of the world, and quite frankly, one of the best places to do dialogue.
And new hires get to visit there?
And new hires get to visit there, yes. It's certainly one of the perks of my jobs to be able to do that. But aside from that, we believe that we're having meaningful impact on a discussion of very underserved topics that require attention, not just immediate attention, but the type of attention we don't give to things anymore, the decades-long type of attention to larger problems that are not just facing people in that region, but also us here at home. So usually when I talk to somebody about what we do, and I say, do you really want to make a difference? It's something that could be lasting for many decades. That's why we do what we do. We connect people together. We are the interlocutors of expertise and policy and discipline, and really trying to find the right group of people that are going to be able to tackle the challenges that are coming forward. And if you want to be a part of that, then we're willing to have you on. And so that's how I approach it, is that you can have a meaningful discussion, something where you'll get some sort of outcome that you've never heard before at any other conference or any other meeting. We've had people that were on opposing sides of very heated political topics admit to each other that both their sides made faults. This happened at a dialogue we had on Egypt. And given the recent climate, between the Muslim Brotherhood and the army and the various political factions in Egypt, the fact that even happened in itself is an amazing outcome. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to do.
On the other hand, if you're dealing with issues that have been discussions, dialogues for many millennia, such as claims and counterclaims to territory in the Middle East and Palestinian areas and so forth, it's kind of hard to maybe retain that optimistic view, I would imagine.
It can be. Particularly, I've done a lot of work with Afghanistan, and that, there can be days where it can be very, very difficult to keep going. But I often remember, if you're not talking, then you're shooting. So I'd rather be talking than shooting. And I think it's critical, even in the most dire circumstances, to keep the dialogue channels open. Because if you don't, then there really is no walking back at that point. It gets repetitive sometimes, very repetitive, but ultimately it's better to be repetitive than to let it go completely. So,
What's a good day for you? A day where you feel that something's been accomplished, you go to sleep with some level of satisfaction versus one that's not.
After our dialogues, which typically we do over 3-day periods, the best day for me is the day at the last hour at the very end, as we're going around the table, and people are telling us, not only did I just generate new thinking and heard new thinking about a subject, but I'm going to take this back with me, work it with my other colleagues, and see what we can do with this. That's where I know what we're doing is really valuable, where you have that critical network of people that know how to solve these kinds of problems, go back and suddenly realize they just learned something new. Those are the best days for me.
Can you give an example of a situation where you thought that hadn't happened, and then the next day at the 11th hour, the dialogue was rescued and you had success?
This is actually before my time, but it was a dialogue in Holling Center I actually participated in as an outside party. It was on Afghanistan, and I remember it was a conference on the Durand Line, which is the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is very contentious and has been a source of trouble for the better part of a century. And I remember on the last day, we were getting to a point where it didn't seem like we had made any progress whatsoever. And then at the very end, in the last hour, all of a sudden they had a declaration of statements that were what they agreed upon. And the Afghans signed off on it, and the Pakistanis signed off on it. And I suddenly sat there realizing, whew, suddenly we got out of that pretty quickly. Because there have been a couple of our dialogues that have been definitely contentious, sometimes where it feels like you may not have made progress. We've also had some, like an Iraq dialogue we did a few years ago that I wasn't a part of, where the outcome didn't actually happen until about 6 months later, when a couple of participants, having thought about it, having gone back to their regular lives, suddenly realized that they needed help in one of the programs that they were working on. It was a higher education dialogue. And as a result of that, they reconnected with each other and actually started up an exchange that was actually very helpful to both institutions. So sometimes it's not immediate. You have to be willing to have that delayed gratification, but ultimately something ends up coming out of it every time.
What is the one issue that you haven't yet tackled that you would like to get your hands around?
We might do something on this in the future, but this is something that's a bit of interest to me, and that's actually healthcare. Healthcare in the Middle East. My father actually has been working in healthcare his entire life, so I always kind of grew up with healthcare around me. But as I was reading some really interesting information the other day, you have healthcare provision issues in some countries in the Middle East. Some of the wealthier countries, you're now having the same kind of situations you're seeing in the West, where cost of healthcare is getting much higher. Disease rates like diabetes are on the rise. I think it's an interesting issue that's really not being touched very much, and it's just as important as many of these other issues to the state social contract, to the provision of how a state functions. It's important to daily life for everybody. It's another one of these big all-encompassing issues. And I don't think it's one that's received a lot of specificity. And so we might do something about that soon. But that's something that I personally would like to grapple around because I think it's just as important.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael Carroll.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.